Rain streaked against the floor-to-ceiling glass of my corner office, blurring the grey Seattle skyline into a watercolour painting of steel and clouds, mirroring the storm that was brewing inside my chest. I sat at my desk, a slab of imported black marble that cost more than my first car, and stared down at the phone vibrating against the polished stone surface. It was a Saturday, a day I usually reserved for deep work away from the chaos of the engineering floor. But the notification on my screen had shattered my concentration completely. It was a message from the family group chat, a digital space where I mostly lurked like a ghost, observing their lives without really being part of them. My younger brother Gage had sent a text that was short, brutal, and devoid of any familial warmth. He told me not to come to the barbecue tomorrow because his wife said I stank up the whole party with my chemical smell. I read the words over and over again, waiting for a punchline that never came, waiting for someone to step in and say it was a cruel joke. Instead, a notification popped up showing that my mother had reacted to the message with a laughing face emoji, and seconds later, my father added a red heart. They were not defending me from the insult, they were endorsing it. A humiliation washed over me like ice water, chilling me despite the climate-controlled warmth of my 45th floor sanctuary. I did not cry, because I had learned a long time ago that my tears were just fuel for their mockery. So I simply typed 2 words, acknowledging the message, and placed the phone face down. To understand why this text message felt like a physical blow to my solar plexus, you have to understand the 28 years of history that preceded it. I grew up in a household where the hierarchy was established early and enforced ruthlessly. My parents believed that being loud was a virtue, being athletic was a necessity, and being smart was a strange, unfortunate affliction that made you difficult to love. Gage, who was 2 years younger than me, was the golden child from the moment he took his first breath. He had the kind of easy, charismatic smile that could charm a $20 bill out of a stranger's wallet, and he played football with a reckless aggression that my father worshipped. I, on the other hand, was Olivia the quiet one, the girl who preferred taking radios apart to see how they worked, rather than cheering from the bleachers. I remembered vividly coming home in the 11th grade with a massive blue ribbon from the state science fair, my heart bursting with a rare moment of pride. I had walked into the kitchen where my mother was cooking Gage's favourite pasta because he had twisted his ankle at practice, and I had held up the ribbon for her to see. She had glanced at it over her shoulder, with the same enthusiasm one might show for a mild weather forecast, telling me it was nice, but warning me not to put it on the refrigerator because she did not want the magnets scratching the stainless steel finish. In the same breath, she had asked me to run to the store to buy ice for Gage's ankle. That was my role in the Anderson family architecture. I was the background noise, the utility player, useful when something needed to be fixed or an errand needed to be run, but embarrassing when I tried to shine. This dynamic had not changed as we entered adulthood. In fact, it had only calcified into something harder and more painful. Even now, as the Executive Vice President of Engineering at Nexara Biolabs, my family had absolutely no idea what I actually did for a living, or how much power I wielded. To them, science was boring, and engineering was for people who lacked social skills. So they had constructed a fantasy version of my career that suited their narrative. They imagined me washing test tubes in a basement or feeding rats in a dark laboratory, earning a pittance while smelling of strange reagents. They had no idea that I managed a team of 200 elite engineers, or that I controlled a budget that could buy our entire hometown 3 times over. I was currently sitting in front of a stack of documents authorizing a $1 billion contract for advanced prosthetic development, yet my family thought I was a glorified janitor. I had never corrected them because, deep down in the terrified child part of my brain, I was afraid that if they knew the extent of my wealth, they would only love me for my wallet. I wanted them to love me for me. But that desire was slowly revealing itself to be a hopeless fantasy. The insult about me smelling like chemicals was a favourite of my sister-in-law Tegan, a woman who had married Gage 6 months ago and immediately identified me as the weak link she could stomp on to elevate herself. She was loud, flashy, and obsessed with appearances, and she had decided that my quiet demeanour and lack of designer logos meant I was beneath her. The irony of Gage uninviting me from the barbecue was so thick it nearly choked me, because the venue for this party was a secret I had been keeping for 3 years. 3 years ago, Gage had come to me with tears in his eyes, sobbing that he had dropped out of college for the second time and had nowhere to live with his girlfriend at the time. My parents were barely scraping by and could not afford to help him, and I, unable to bear the sight of my little brother in pain, had done something incredibly stupid out of love. I had purchased a beautiful 3-bedroom house on Elm Street, a property with a sprawling backyard and a renovated kitchen, using a limited liability company so my name would not appear on the public deed. I had told Gage that I knew a benevolent landlord who was looking for a caretaker, and that if he covered the utilities and kept the lawn mowed, he could live there rent-free. Gage had hugged me then, telling me I was a lifesaver, even if I was a nerd, a backhanded compliment I had accepted with a smile. For 3 years, I had paid the property taxes, the insurance premiums, and the maintenance costs. I had paid for the new roof when it leaked last winter, and I had paid the plumber when Gage tried to flush a t-shirt down the toilet. I was his landlord, his benefactor, and the reason he had a roof over his head, and now he was banning me from the very property I owned because his wife thought I wasn't cool enough to stand on my own grass. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain intensify as the grey light washed over my reflection. I saw a woman in a tailored navy suit that cost $4,000, her hair pulled back in a sharp professional bun, radiating authority and competence. But inside, I felt like that little girl holding the blue ribbon, waiting for a good job that would never come. My phone buzzed again, breaking my reverie, and I walked back to the desk to see a private message from my father. I expected an apology, or perhaps a secret admission that he disagreed with Gage, but what I read made my blood turn to ice. He wrote that I shouldn't be mad at my brother, that Tegan was just particular and I knew how women could get. He suggested that to show there were no hard feelings, I should send a gift card to cover the cost of the food for the party I wasn't allowed to attend. I stared at the message, feeling a metallic taste in my mouth. They had kicked me out, humiliated me in the group chat, and now they wanted me to pay for the hamburgers I was forbidden from eating. Something inside me snapped, not with a loud bang, but with the quiet, definitive click of a heavy lock sliding into place. I did not reply to my father. Instead, I placed the phone in my drawer and turned the key, locking it away along with my desire for their approval. I was done playing the victim. I was done being the weird sister who could be milked for favours and discarded when company came over. I spent the next hour preparing for a meeting with the board of directors, channeling my rage into cold, hard efficiency. I had to present the quarterly earnings, and I needed to be the shark everyone in the industry knew me to be. But as I worked, a countdown had started in the back of my mind. I did not know exactly what form my retribution would take, but I knew the free ride was over. I finished my work late that evening and slept fitfully, dreaming of locked doors and laughing faces. The next morning, Saturday, I returned to the office early. Saturday mornings at Nexara Biolabs were usually my favourite time. The building was mostly empty, the frantic energy of the week replaced by the hum of servers and the quiet efficiency of the weekend cleaning crew. I had asked Sarah, my personal executive assistant, to come in for a few hours to help with some sensitive filing, and the two of us were working in comfortable silence. My office was a fortress of solitude, a place where I was respected and feared, a stark contrast to the way I was treated on Elm Street. I was reviewing the specifications for a new neural interface when the intercom on my desk beeped sharply, cutting through the silence. I frowned, knowing the reception desk in the lobby was unstaffed on weekends, meaning only security was downstairs. I pressed the button and asked Sarah what was happening, my voice calm despite the interruption. Sarah's voice came through the speaker, sounding tight and nervous, apologising profusely for disturbing me. She told me there were two people in the lobby demanding to see whoever handled the money for the company. I paused, my hand hovering over the paperwork. It was an odd request for a Saturday morning, usually indicative of a confused vendor or a lost delivery driver. I asked who they were, and Sarah hesitated before replying that they claimed to be family. She said their names were Mr. Gage Anderson and his wife. My blood ran cold, and the pen I was holding slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the marble. Gage was here. He had never visited my office in his life. He didn't even know the address, only the name of the company. He must have looked it up online. I felt a surge of nausea, followed immediately by a surge of adrenaline. They were here, at my sanctuary, the one place where I was untouchable. I told Sarah to send them up, my voice steady and devoid of the panic fluttering in my chest. Sarah asked if I was sure, noting that the woman seemed very agitated and that security could remove them. But I insisted. I wanted to handle this. I needed to handle this. I stood up and smoothed the front of my skirt, walking over to the polished cabinet to pour myself a glass of sparkling water. I needed a moment to compose myself before the elevator doors opened. Why were they here? The barbecue wasn't until tomorrow. Had they come to apologize? Had they realized how cruel they had been? No, I knew better than that. Tegan did not apologize. She escalated. I watched through the glass wall of my office as the elevator doors at the end of the long hallway dinged and slid open. Tegan stepped out first, and she was a vision of chaotic energy against the pristine, minimalist backdrop of the corporate floor. She was wearing a bright red bodycon dress that was far too tight for a Saturday morning business setting, with huge sunglasses perched on her head and a knockoff designer bag clutched under her arm. Gage trailed behind her, looking uncomfortable in jeans and a polo shirt, his eyes wide as he took in the expensive carpet, the silence, and the palpable aura of wealth that permeated the floor. They looked like tourists who had wandered into a restricted zone, completely out of place and painfully unaware of the shark tank they had just entered. They walked down the hall, and I could see Tegan reading the nameplates on the doors, her lips moving as she sounded out titles like Chief Financial Officer and Vice President of Operations. I could hear her shrill voice through the glass, complaining that they needed to find the investment guy, someone who cut checks, not these corporate drones. Gage mumbled something about calling me first to see if I was working, but Tegan snapped at him, her voice echoing in the quiet corridor. She told him there was no point in calling me because I probably mopped the floors or washed beakers, and I would only embarrass them. She insisted they needed a decision maker. They were getting closer now, approaching the double glass doors of my office. I moved back to my desk and sat down in my high-backed leather chair, folding my hands on the black marble. I watched as Tegan stopped dead in her tracks. She was staring at the large silver letters mounted on the wall next to my door. Executive Vice President of Engineering, Olivia Anderson. She froze, reading it once, then twice. Her mouth opened slightly, and Gage bumped into her back, asking what was wrong, before his eyes followed hers to the sign. I pressed the button under my desk, and the glass doors slid open with a soft, hydraulic whoosh. I said, my voice projecting power I didn't know I possessed. I sat motionless in my high-backed leather chair, my hands clasped loosely on the cool surface of the black marble desk, watching the realization wash over them like a slow tide of sewage. Tegan walked in first, her heels clicking aggressively on the polished concrete floor, but the rhythm of her stride faltered as her eyes darted around the room. She took in the panoramic view of the rain-swept Seattle skyline, the original modern art hanging on the walls, and the shelves lined with industry awards that she likely did not understand. She looked at me, then back at the silver lettering on the wall outside, and finally she spoke, her voice losing its usual shrill edge and replaced by a tone of genuine confusion. She asked what this was, gesturing vaguely at the expanse of my office as if it were a hallucination. I answered simply that this was my office, keeping my voice devoid of any warmth or welcome. Gage looked like he was about to be sick. his face paling as he stepped further into the room, looking at me as if I were a stranger. He stammered that he thought I worked here as a technician, whispering that they believed I was in a lab somewhere. I told him that he thought what he wanted to think, and I asked them directly why they were here. Tegan recovered from her shock faster than Gage did, which was a testament to her nature as a predator. She smelled money, and the scent of it allowed her to override her embarrassment instantly. She straightened her posture, adjusted the strap of her knockoff bag, and plastered a fake plastic smile onto her face that did not reach her eyes. She walked right up to my desk, invading my personal space, and dropped a glossy folder onto my delicate engineering schematics. She exclaimed that this was even better than they had hoped, saying that they did not have to deal with strangers because family helps family. I looked down at the folder, which was emblazoned with the words G&T Lifestyle Brand Investment Opportunity in a cheap gold font. I asked her what this was, my eyes narrowing. Tegan leaned forward, placing her hands on my desk, and I felt a surge of irritation that she was touching my things. She explained that it was their future, a lifestyle brand encompassing influencer marketing, makeup, clothing, and consulting. She said they needed seed money and investors to get off the ground. I asked how much they needed, keeping my face impassive. Tegan said $2 million, as if she were asking to borrow $20 for lunch. She elaborated that they needed inventory, a studio, and a marketing budget, and since I was obviously loaded, gesturing wildly around the room, I could write the check today and they would cut me in for 5% of the company. I looked at Gage, who was staring at his shoes, unable to meet my gaze. He knew this was wrong. He knew they had just insulted me yesterday, telling me I smelled too bad to attend a family gathering. Yet he was too weak to stop her. I spoke softly to him, reminding him that just yesterday he had told me not to come to his house because I stank. Tegan waved her hand dismissively, laughing a nervous, tinkling laugh. She said that was just a joke, claiming I knew how they joked and that I shouldn't be so sensitive. She pivoted back to the money immediately, insisting that this was a serious business investment and I would make my money back within a year. I stood up then, and because I am tall and was wearing 3-inch heels, I towered over Tegan, making her take a subconscious step back. I told her no. She blinked rapidly, her brain unable to process the rejection. She asked what I meant, and I clarified that I was not investing, I was not giving them money, and I was not family, only when it was convenient for their bank account. Tegan's face turned a blotchy red, the fake smile vanishing instantly to reveal the snarl beneath. She hissed that I was selfish, accusing me of sitting in my ivory tower with all this money while refusing to help my own brother. She shouted that he was drowning in debt and they needed this money to survive. I told her that sounded like a problem for them to solve, not me. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and instructed Sarah to send security to my office, requesting 2 escorts. Tegan's eyes widened and she hissed that I wouldn't dare. I told her I just did. She turned on Gage, screaming at him to do something, to tell me to listen to her pitch because she had worked hard on it. I asked Gage if she had worked as hard on the business plan as she had on the text message insulting me. Gage flinched as if I had slapped him. Moments later, 2 uniformed security guards appeared at the door, large men who radiated professionalism. I asked them to escort these visitors out of the building, sitting back down and picking up my pen to signal the meeting was over. As the guards stepped toward Tegan, she shrieked at him not to touch her, grabbing her folder and screaming that I would regret this. She yelled that I thought I was better than them, but I was nothing more than a lonely, miserable spinster with a checkbook. I did not look up as they were marched out, though I heard Tegan screaming insults all the way down the hallway until the elevator doors dinged shut, returning the office to its blissful silence. My hand was shaking slightly as I held the pen, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the confrontation. It was the realization that a line had been irrevocably crossed. They did not see me as a human being with feelings, but as an automated teller machine that they could insult and withdraw from simultaneously. I took a deep breath, thinking the worst was over, thinking I had made my point and they would retreat to lick their wounds. I was wrong. The silence was merely the eye of the hurricane. By the time I arrived home that evening, my phone had become a war zone. Gage had called 6 times, and my mother had left 3 voicemails. I poured myself a large glass of wine in my kitchen, looking out at the city lights, and decided to listen to one of the messages. My mother's voice filled the room, trembling with indignation. She said Gage had called her crying, claiming I'd thrown them out of my office and humiliated Tegan in front of my employees. She asked how I could be so cruel when they had come to me for help, reminding me that we were raised to support each other and demanding I call my brother to apologize immediately. I laughed, a dry, humourless sound that echoed in the empty apartment. Apologize? For refusing to give $2 million to people who despised me? I deleted the voicemail and sat on my sofa trying to decompress. My condo was a modern, minimalist sanctuary downtown, a place I had bought with my own money, owing nothing to anyone. I felt entirely alone in the world, a solitude that was usually comforting, but tonight felt heavy and suffocating. Then my phone pinged with a different kind of alert, a sharp, urgent sound that I recognized immediately as a notification from my bank. I frowned, setting my wine glass down. The screen displayed a fraud alert from Wells Fargo, stating that a new credit inquiry had been detected. I opened the app, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. The alert detailed a loan application for $480,000 that had just been submitted in my name. I clicked for more details and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a small business loan application, listing Olivia Anderson as the primary applicant and Gage Anderson as the co-signer. They hadn't just asked for money, they were trying to take it. I scrolled through the application details with trembling fingers. It had been submitted online less than an hour ago, using my parents' address as my residence and, most chillingly, my social security number. I remembered suddenly that a few years ago, when I was helping my parents refinance their mortgage, I had left some old tax documents in a file cabinet at their house. Gage must have gone to our parents' house, raided the file cabinet and stolen my identity to commit financial fraud. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to close my eyes. This was no longer just toxic family drama. This was a felony. I dialed the number for my private banker, Mark, knowing that even on a Saturday night he would answer for a client of my standing. He picked up on the second ring, his voice warm but professional. I told him to listen carefully, explaining that I had just received a fraud alert and that someone was applying for a loan in my name. Mark switched to crisis mode instantly, typing in the background as he confirmed he was looking at the application right now. He noted that it had been flagged because the IP address was residential and did not match my usual activity patterns. He asked if I had authorized a loan for G&T Global. I told him firmly that I had absolutely not authorized it and that it was a fraudulent application. Mark said he was rejecting it immediately, but then he paused. He pointed out that the co-signer was listed as Gage Anderson and asked if that was a relative. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the betrayal crushing me. I admitted that yes, it was my brother. There was a heavy silence on the line before Mark spoke again, his voice grave. He told me this was serious identity theft and asked if I wanted to file a police report, explaining that if we flagged this as criminal fraud, the bank would be obligated to notify the authorities. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. This was my little brother, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy I had bought a house for. If I filed a report, he could go to jail. But then I remembered Tegan's face in my office, her screaming that I was a miserable spinster. I remembered the text telling me not to come to the barbecue. They were trying to ruin my credit, trying to steal $500,000 from me because I had said no. I told Mark to do it. I told him to flag it, freeze everything, and put a lock on my credit reports. 10 minutes after I hung up with Mark, the digital attacks began. My phone started vibrating incessantly with messages from the family group chat. Gage was the first to text, asking if I was insane for blocking the loan. He claimed they were approved and that I had ruined it. Tegan followed immediately, calling me a jealous, The bitter woman who did not want them to succeed because I wanted them to be poor like I used to be. Then my mother chimed in, begging me to just sign the paper, claiming Gage said it was just a formality and promising he would pay it back. My father added that family helps family and that I was taking this too far. They were gaslighting me in real time, rewriting reality to frame me as the villain for preventing them from robbing me. I did not reply to a single message. Instead, I took screenshots of everything: the loan alert, the abusive texts, the timestamps showing the sequence of events. I created a folder on my computer named Quote 3 and saved every file. I was shaking, but I wasn't crying anymore. The sadness had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I was an engineer. I solved problems for a living. My family had just become a problem that needed to be solved, and I was going to engineer their downfall with the same precision I applied to my work. I went to the kitchen and made myself a sandwich, eating it standing over the sink while staring into the darkness of my living room. I felt entirely alone, a singular entity fighting a war on all fronts. But I wasn't entirely alone, because just as I finished eating, the doorbell rang. I checked the security camera feed on my phone and saw no one at the door, just a small package sitting on the welcome mat. I walked to the door, unlocked it, and looked out into the empty hallway. I looked down at the package. It was a brown manila envelope, thick and heavy, with no postage on it, meaning it had been hand-delivered. I picked it up and brought it inside, sitting at the dining table under the harsh light of the chandelier. I turned it over and saw my name written on the front in shaky, familiar handwriting. It was my father's handwriting. My hands trembled as I held the envelope. My father had been texting me just minutes ago, telling me to help Gage, taking their side in the group chat. Why would he send me a secret package? I tore open the seal, my heart pounding in my ears. Inside was a thick stack of papers clipped together, and on top was a handwritten note on a piece of yellow legal pad paper. I picked up the note and began to read. My father wrote that he knew I thought he was blind, and he knew I thought he always took Gage's side. He admitted that maybe he did, because my mother loved Gage so much and he couldn't fight her on it. He called himself a coward, a confession that made my chest ache. But then he wrote that he was not stupid. He said that when Gage married Tegan, something didn't sit right with him. She knew too much about money, but never seemed to have any. And she talked about assets while driving a car that was 3 payments behind. He revealed that 6 months ago, he had taken money from his retirement account without telling my mother, and hired a private investigator named Miller to look into Tegan. He said he had received the report yesterday and was going to show Gage, but he knew Gage wouldn't listen because he was under her spell. He wrote that my mother would just dismiss it as fake, but he said that I was smart, the smart one, acknowledging my intelligence for the first time in years. He warned me that they were going to destroy each other, but begged me not to let them destroy me. He ended the note by asking me to handle this because he couldn't. I stared at the paper, tears pricking my eyes. He was throwing the grenade to me so he didn't have to pull the pin himself, proving his cowardice once again. But he had also given me the ammunition I needed to end the war. I set the note aside and picked up the report. It was 42 pages long, and the subject line read, Tegan Marie Brooks, aka Tegan Jones. I turned to the first page, and what I saw made me realise that the $2 million request and the loan fraud were just the tip of the iceberg. I sat at my dining table, the overhead light casting long shadows across the documents spread before me, and began to read the private investigator's report. The first few pages were standard background checks, addresses in Atlanta, Miami, and Dallas, indicating a woman who moved frequently, likely running from something or someone. Then came the financial history, which was nothing short of a bloodbath. Tegan had 3 bankruptcies in the last 10 years and 6 civil judgments against her for unpaid debts. But the real horror story began on page 12, under the heading, quote, Tegan had been married 5 years ago to a man named Maverick Jones in Atlanta. The report detailed the divorce proceedings with clinical precision, painting a picture of systematic financial abuse. Tegan had taken out 7 credit cards in Maverick's name without his knowledge and maxed them all out, spending over $80,000 on luxury goods, vacations, and clothes. She had forged his signature on a car loan, and when the debt collectors inevitably came calling, Maverick lost everything. He lost his house, his small business, and ended up living in his truck for 6 months, while Tegan claimed emotional abuse and fled to a new state to find a new victim. And now she was doing the exact same thing to Gage. I flipped to the section on my brother, and the private investigator had dug deep. The list of liabilities was staggering. Gage Anderson had credit cards maxed out to the tune of $45,000, personal loans totaling $30,000, and a high-interest auto loan for $60,000 for a Range Rover that was registered to Tegan, but financed entirely in Gage's name. The total debt was over $180,000. And that wasn't even the worst part. The report noted that Tegan had recently made inquiries about life insurance policies for Gage. My stomach turned violently. She was bleeding him dry, dismantling his life piece by piece. And now that she had tapped him out, she was looking for a fresh host. The $480,000 loan application in my name made perfect sense now. She needed a new source of funds to keep her house of cards from collapsing. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the room pressing against my ears. My father wanted me to handle it because he was too weak to do it himself. I looked at the date on the report. It was current. I looked at the contact information for Maverick Jones. He was working as a mechanic in Atlanta. It was late, but I didn't care. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Maverick Jones. It rang 4 times before a rough, tired voice answered, asking simply, quote 5. I asked if this was Maverick Jones, and he countered by asking who was asking. I told him my name was Olivia Anderson and that my brother was married to Tegan Brooks. There was a long silence on the other end, a silence heavy with pain and old anger. Finally, Maverick spoke, his voice filled with a weary resignation. He said he was sorry to hear that and advised me to hang up and run because that was the only way to survive her. I told him I wasn't going to run. I was going to stop her. I told him I needed his help. He asked why he would help me, and I told him because she stole his life and I could help him get a piece of his dignity back. I offered to fly him to Seattle the next morning, first class. He asked what for, sarcastically suggesting a family reunion. I replied coldly that we had a barbecue to attend. There was a pause, then a low chuckle that sounded like gravel grinding together. He asked what time the flight was. I smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that felt unfamiliar on my face. I told him I would text the details and advised him to pack a bag because we were going to war. Sunday morning arrived with a grey, drizzling sky, the kind of Seattle weather that seeps into your bones and makes the world feel small and enclosed. But I didn't feel the cold. I felt a burning, focused energy that kept me warm. I drove my Audi to SeaTac Airport to pick up Maverick Jones. I'd never seen a photo of him, but I knew him the moment he walked out of the arrival gate. He looked like a man who had been chewed up by life and spit out. Tall and broad-shouldered, but carrying himself with a defensive hunch. He wore a faded denim jacket and work boots, carrying a small duffel bag, and his eyes scanned the crowd with the wariness of a stray dog expecting a kick. I waved, and he walked over, eyeing my expensive coat and heels with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. He asked if I was Olivia, his voice gravelly from years of hard work and perhaps too many cigarettes. I thanked him for coming. He shrugged, saying I bought the ticket and that he wouldn't miss the chance to see Tegan panic for anything in the world. We didn't talk much on the drive back to the city. I took him to a diner for breakfast, and over coffee and eggs, I showed him the file my father had sent. He flipped through it, his jaw tightening as he recognized the patterns. He tapped a page and said quietly that it was her, all right. He told me she had done this to him with a boat, buying it in his name when he didn't even like the water, then selling it for cash and leaving him with the loan. I told him she was doing it to my brother now and trying to do it to me. Maverick looked at me and asked what the plan was. I said we were just going to walk in and end it. We drove to Elm Street, arriving in the late afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained a bruised purple. My brother's truck was in the driveway, and Tegan's leased Range Rover, which I now knew was in Gage's name, was parked behind it. The house looked nice, a testament to the money and care I had poured into it over the last 3 years. I felt a pang of bitterness looking at the flower beds I had paid for and the front door I had painted myself. I walked up the path, Maverick a step behind me, like a silent shadow. I didn't knock. I had a key. It was my house, after all. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the familiar scent of the hallway hitting me, a mix of vanilla air freshener and stale beer. I called out Gage's name. I heard shuffling from the living room, and a moment later Gage appeared in the hallway, wearing sweatpants and holding a beer. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, his posture slumped. When he saw me, his face hardened into a scowl. He asked what I was doing there, reminding me that he had told me Tegan didn't want to see me, especially after yesterday. I told him I wasn't there to apologize. I stepped into the foyer and told him I was there to introduce him to someone. I stepped aside, revealing Maverick. Gage frowned, confused, looking from me to the tall stranger in the denim jacket. He asked who this was. Before I could answer, Tegan walked into the hallway. She was wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of wine, looking every bit the lady of the manor she pretended to be. She started to ask who was at the door, but then she saw him. She stopped dead. The colour drained from her face so fast it looked like she might faint. The glass of wine wobbled in her hand, red liquid sloshing over the rim and splashing onto the hardwood floor I had paid to refinish. Maverick spoke first, his voice calm and terrifyingly steady. She whispered his name, as if seeing a ghost. Gage looked between them, sensing the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. He asked if she knew him. Maverick answered for her, stating that he was her husband, well, ex-husband, the one she left with $80,000 of debt. Tegan screamed immediately, a high-pitched sound of pure panic. She yelled that he was lying, screaming at Gage to get him out of there, claiming he was a stalker who had abused her. Maverick didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded stack of papers, tossing them onto the hallway table with a heavy slap. He told Gage he had the court documents right there, bankruptcy filings, police reports for fraud, and the letter from the credit card company where she had forged his signature. Gage looked at the papers, then at Tegan, his confusion morphing into fear. He asked her what this was. Tegan shrieked at him not to look at it, lunging for the papers, but I stepped in between them, blocking her path. I told Gage to read it. Gage picked up the papers with shaking hands. He read the summary, his eyes scanning the dates. He looked up at Tegan, his voice trembling. He asked her if she had filed for bankruptcy 3 months before they met, noting that she had told him she was a successful interior designer. Tegan cried out that she was, claiming she just had bad luck. Maverick cut in, asking Gage if she had maxed out his cards yet. Gage went pale, the blood leaving his face as the truth hit him. He looked at me and whispered that she had asked about a life insurance policy last week. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Tegan looked cornered, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape route. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled that this was a setup, claiming I was jealous and had brought him here to ruin her marriage because I was a lonely, bitter spinster. I told her calmly that I wasn't there to ruin her marriage. I was there to evict her. I reached into my purse and pulled out a single document in a blue folder, slapping it down on the table next to Maverick's papers. Gage whispered, asking what that was. I told him it was the deed to the house. Tegan froze. She stammered that Gage rented this from a landlord. I told her I was the landlord. I explained that I had bought the house 3 years ago under an LLC, paid for the roof, paid the taxes, and let them live there for free because I loved my brother. I looked at Gage, who was staring at me with his mouth open, his world crumbling. He stammered, asking if I really owned the house. I confirmed that I did. And since they had decided I stank up the party and his wife was trying to steal $500,000 from me, I pointed to the door and told them they had 30 days to vacate. I told them to consider this their official notice. Tegan's face twisted into a mask of ugly rage. She screamed that I couldn't do that, claiming they had rights, squatters' rights. I corrected her instantly, telling her they had a lease agreement which I signed as the LLC manager, and that it had a termination clause for criminal activity. I added that identity theft was criminal activity. Gage collapsed. He literally slid down the wall and sat on the floor, putting his head in his hands and sobbing. It wasn't a quiet cry. It was the sound of a man whose entire reality had just shattered. Tegan stood over him, screaming that I was a witch, a liar, and a thief. I told Maverick we were done here. We walked out, leaving the chaos behind us. As I closed the front door, I could still hear Tegan screaming at Gage to man up and do something. I got in the car, my hands steady on the steering wheel. Maverick asked if I was okay. I told him I would be, and that we should get him to his hotel. If I thought the confrontation on Sunday was the end, I was naive. It was just the declaration of war. The next morning, Monday, I went to work as usual, needing the routine to anchor me. But my phone became a relentless barrage of noise. By 9 in the morning, Gage had sent me 40 texts. He begged me not to do this, claiming Tegan was just stressed and didn't mean the identity theft. He said she was just trying to surprise him with the business. He pleaded that they had nowhere to go and that Mum and Dad were going to kill me. Then came the texts from my parents. My mother demanded I call her immediately, saying Tegan told them I brought a strange man to their house and threatened them. She asked how I could lie to them for 3 years about owning the house and accused me of tearing the family apart. My father texted that this was cruel, even for me, claiming Tegan was fragile and that I needed to apologise and fix the loan situation because they needed money, not eviction notices. I read the messages during my coffee break, feeling a cold detachment. They didn't ask if Tegan was a criminal. They didn't ask if I was okay after having my identity stolen. They only cared that the boat was rocking and that I was the one rocking it. I didn't reply to any of them. Instead, I called my lawyer and told him to proceed with everything: full eviction and a formal police report regarding the fraudulent loan application. My lawyer asked if I was sure, warning me that once we filed the report, the district attorney might pick it up and my sister-in-law could face jail time. I told him I was sure. She didn't care if I lost my credit, so I didn't care if she lost her freedom. By Tuesday, Tegan had changed tactics. I received an alert from my credit monitoring service showing another inquiry, this time for a luxury car lease. She was desperate, trying to grab as much cash or assets as possible before the ship sank. Because I had frozen my credit, the application was instantly denied. Realising the walls were closing in, Tegan started posting on Facebook. She wrote long, rambling posts about toxic in-laws and rich people who think they can control you, tagging me and my company. She claimed her sister-in-law, Olivia Anderson, VP at Nexara, was kicking them out on the street because she was jealous of their happiness. I watched the likes roll in from my cousins and aunts. It hurt, I won't lie. It felt like the whole world was believing a lie. I wanted to comment, to post the bankruptcy records, but I stopped myself. No explanations. I had promised myself. I let her dig her hole. On Wednesday, my mother showed up at my office building. Security called me to say she was in the lobby and refused to leave until she saw me. I sighed and went down. She was sitting on a bench near the fountains, clutching her purse and looking older than I remembered. When she saw me, she stood up, her face wet with tears, and sobbed loud enough for the receptionist to hear, asking how I could do this. She said Gage was my brother, and I was making him homeless. I told her quietly that he wasn't homeless. He had 30 days and a job, so he could rent an apartment like an adult. She cried that he couldn't because his credit was ruined. I interrupted her, clarifying that Tegan ruined his credit, not me. I told her Tegan stole his money and tried to steal $500,000 from me. I asked if she had asked Tegan about that. My mother waved her hand dismissively, saying it was just a misunderstanding and that Tegan had explained she mixed up the paperwork. I stared at her, terrified by the depth of her delusion. I told her that using my social security number without asking was a felony, not a mix-up. My mother shook her head, whispering that I was so cold and that I cared more about my rules and money than people. She gave me an ultimatum. If I went through with this eviction, I shouldn't bother coming to Christmas or anything else. I felt a crack in my heart, but also a weight lift. I told her, okay. She blinked, shocked that her threat hadn't worked. I repeated that if the choice was letting Tegan rob me or losing my family, I chose to lose the family. I turned and walked back to the elevators without looking back. Memorial Day arrived the following Monday, bringing with it a sky that had cleared into a brilliant, mocking blue. The family barbecue was an institution in the Anderson clan, a sacred event where attendance was mandatory and appearances were everything. For decades, it had been held at my parents' modest ranch house, but this year, in a twist of fate that felt almost scripted, it was scheduled for Gage's house on Elm Street. My house. I had not been formally uninvited, other than that initial cruel text message from Gage, and since I was the legal owner of the property, I had every right to be there. I spent the morning preparing not for a party, but for an execution. I chose my outfit with the precision of a soldier donning armour, selecting a sharp white blazer that cost more than Tegan's entire wardrobe, paired with dark, tailored jeans and stilettos that clicked ominously on my hardwood floors. I looked professional, calm, and undeniably wealthy. I looked like the executive vice president of a billion-dollar company, not the weird sister who fixed radios. I grabbed the thick manila folder from my desk, the weapon that contained the sum total of their deception and my vindication. This folder held the deed, the eviction notice, the police report number for the identity theft, and the private investigator's damning report on Tegan's past. I checked my reflection one last time, seeing not a victim, but a judge. I drove to Elm Street around 2 in the afternoon, the time when the party would be in full swing. The street was lined with cars, a testament to the turnout. I could smell the charcoal smoke drifting over the fence, a nostalgic scent that usually brought comfort, but today smelled like burning bridges. I could hear music thumping, a generic pop playlist that Tegan undoubtedly chose. I parked my Audi directly in front of the driveway, blocking in Gage's truck, a subtle power move that went unnoticed by the guests but felt satisfying to me. I walked up the driveway, the heavy folder tucked under my arm, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. I unlatched the gate to the backyard and stepped inside. There were about 30 people there, aunts, uncles, cousins, and neighbours I had known since childhood. My dad was manning the grill, flipping burgers with a forced joviality. My mother was moving through the crowd with a bowl of potato salad, playing the perfect hostess. Gage was sitting at a picnic table, looking pale and thin, nursing a beer as if it were medicine. Tegan was holding court near the cooler, laughing loudly in a floral sundress, acting as if she hadn't spent the week trying to destroy my life. The conversation died instantly as I walked onto the grass. It started as a ripple of silence near the gate and spread outward until the only sound was the sizzling of meat on the grill and the thumping bass of the music. Tegan saw me first. Her smile dropped like a stone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. She shouted across the yard, demanding to know what I was doing there, reminding me loudly that Gage had told me not to come. My dad looked up from the grill, his spatula freezing in mid-air. He looked terrified, his eyes darting between me and the guests, knowing that the facade of the happy family was about to shatter. I spoke clearly, my voice carrying across the silent yard without shouting, stating that I was there to check on my property. Tegan marched toward me, her face twisting into a snarl. She screamed at me to get out, accusing me of trespassing and claiming this was their house. I ignored her, walking past her outstretched arm as if she were a ghost, and headed straight for the main picnic table in the center of the yard. I dropped the heavy folder onto the table, right between the bowl of baked beans and the platter of corn. It made a loud, authoritative thud that caused my Aunt Linda to jump. My Uncle Steve, who was holding a hot dog, looked at the folder and then at me, asking nervously what this was. I looked around the circle of faces, seeing the confusion and the judgment, and I decided it was time to rewrite the narrative. I opened the folder and spread the papers out across the plastic tablecloth, displacing the condiments. I pointed to the first document, the deed to the house. I announced to the silent crowd that this was the deed to the property they were standing on. I explained that it belonged to Olivia Anderson Holdings, a limited liability company I had formed 3 years ago. I told them I had bought this house so that Gage would not be homeless, paying for the roof, the taxes, and the maintenance, while letting him live there rent-free. A collective gasp went through the crowd. My cousins whispered to each other, looking at the house with new eyes. The narrative that Gage was a successful homeowner and I was a struggling technician evaporated in seconds. I pointed to the next paper, the eviction notice. I told them that this was the legal notice I had served Gage and Tegan last week. I explained that I was evicting them not just because Tegan had never paid a dime of rent, but because she had committed a felony on the premises. Tegan shrieked that I was a liar, lunging forward to grab the papers. I caught her wrist in midair, my grip iron tight. I didn't look at her. I looked at my parents. I told Tegan to let go, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. She pulled her hand back, rubbing her wrist, her eyes wild with fear and rage. I moved to the third document, the police report. I announced that this was filed 3 days ago for identity theft. I told the family that Tegan had tried to take out a $480,000 business loan in my name using stolen documents and my social security number. I watched the horror dawn on my aunts' faces. My cousin Mike pulled out his phone, likely to text the rest of the family who weren't there. I explained that she had tried to ruin my credit and steal $500,000 from me because I had refused to invest in her imaginary lifestyle brand. The shame that had been projected onto me for years shifted instantly. It was no longer Olivia the weird spinster. It was Tegan the criminal. Tegan started shouting that it was a misunderstanding, that I was twisting everything, but her voice sounded thin and desperate against the weight of the evidence. I wasn't done. I pulled out the final document, the private investigator's report on Maverick Jones. I held it up for everyone to see. I told them that this was the record of her previous marriage, where she had bankrupted her husband, Maverick Jones, and left him with $80,000 in debt. I turned my gaze to Gage, who was still sitting at the picnic table, looking small and broken. I told the crowd that she had done the exact same thing to my brother, who was currently sitting on $180,000 of debt right now. All eyes turned to Gage. He was crying again, tears streaming down his face, stripping away the last remnants of his golden child persona. My mother walked over to him, her hands trembling. She whispered, asking if this was true. Gage nodded slowly, unable to look at her. He admitted that she had spent it all, that the truck was gone, the accounts were empty, and he had nothing. The silence in the backyard was absolute. The neighbours were watching over the fence. The family was backing away from Tegan as if she were contagious. Tegan looked around, realising she had lost the audience. She melted down completely. She started screaming, pointing a shaking finger at Gage. She yelled that it was his fault, calling him a loser who couldn't give her the life she wanted. Then she spun around and pointed at me, screaming that I was a hoarder, that I had millions and wouldn't share, and that I was evil. I looked at her calmly, feeling absolutely nothing. I told her softly that I wasn't evil. I was just done. I turned my attention to my parents, who stood frozen by the grill. They looked old and defeated. They had enabled this. They had watched me be treated like dirt for 28 years, laughing at the jokes, encouraging the disrespect. And even when they knew Tegan was a fraud, they had asked me to pay her off to keep the peace. They had chosen their comfort over my dignity, and now they were losing both. I told them to have a nice afternoon. I turned to leave, walking back toward the gate with my head high. Behind me, I heard Gage call out my name. I stopped and turned around. He had fallen to his knees in the grass, a pathetic figure in his designer jeans. He begged me not to kick them out. He promised he would divorce her. He pleaded for me to help him one more time. I looked at my brother on his knees, and for a fleeting second, I remembered buying him ice cream when he was 5. I remembered helping him with his homework. But then I remembered the text message. "Don't come to the barbecue. My wife says you stink up the whole party." I looked at him and told him that he had 30 days. I reminded him that he had used those days to lie to me, to try to steal from me, and to allow his wife to slander me. I told him he was a grown man and that he needed to figure it out. I turned back to the gate and walked out. I didn't look back at the chaos I had left behind. I got into my car, my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't cry. I turned on the radio, found a classic rock station, and drove away as the opening chords of a Led Zeppelin song filled the cabin. I felt lighter than I had in years. The toxic tether that had bound me to their approval had finally been severed. I drove to a steakhouse downtown, sat at the bar, and ordered a filet mignon and a glass of expensive red wine. I ate alone, surrounded by strangers, and I had never felt more at peace. The fallout was fast, brutal, and entirely self-inflicted on their part. The eviction proceeded without delay. Tegan tried to fight it in court, claiming squatters' rights and emotional distress. But she didn't have a lawyer because she couldn't afford one, and my documentation was flawless. The sheriff arrived exactly 30 days later to escort them out. I wasn't there, but I heard from a neighbour that Tegan screamed the entire time, throwing clothes onto the lawn and cursing my name. Gage just sat on the curb, his head in his hands, watching his life be dismantled. The police investigation regarding the loan fraud moved forward aggressively. Because I refused to drop the charges, the district attorney picked up the case. It turned out Tegan had done this before in other states, but the victims had been too embarrassed or too in love to press charges. I was neither. She was arrested 2 weeks after the barbecue, led away in handcuffs from a motel room where she and Gage had been staying. She was charged with wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery. She is currently awaiting trial, and since she has prior civil judgments for similar behaviour, her lawyer is trying to cut a plea deal for minimal jail time, but the prosecutor is pushing for a sentence that will keep her away from credit applications for a long time. Maverick, her ex-husband, actually flew back up to Seattle to testify at her bail hearing. We had dinner afterwards, and he told me with a grim smile that seeing her in an orange jumpsuit was the best vacation he had ever taken. He looked lighter too, as if a ghost had finally been exorcised. As for Gage, his life collapsed completely. The background check for his sales job flagged his massive debt and the pending civil lawsuits from creditors. He was considered a liability and was fired within a week of the barbecue. Without an income and with his credit score in the low 400s, he couldn't rent an apartment, not even in the worst parts of the city. This is where the family values of my parents finally cost them everything they had worked for. They couldn't let their golden child be homeless. The shame would be too great. So they did exactly what I knew they would do. They sold their house, the house I grew up in, the house they had lived in for 30 years. They used the equity to pay off Gage's most urgent debts so he wouldn't go to jail for bad checks. They downsized to a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment in a less desirable part of town. Gage lives in the second bedroom, a 30-year-old man sleeping in a twin bed, surrounded by boxes of his participation trophies. I hear through the grapevine that it is a miserable existence. Tegan is gone. She fled back to the East Coast the moment bail was posted, leaving Gage with all the debt she had accrued in his name. She abandoned him just as easily as she had abandoned Maverick, proving that her love was always conditional on the limit of the credit card. My parents spend their days arguing about money and blaming the unfair system for their misfortune. Occasionally, they try to blame me, rewriting history to make themselves the victims of my greed. My mother sent me a letter last Christmas, a handwritten note on cheap stationery. She wrote that she hoped I was happy in my big glass tower while my family suffered. She claimed I could have fixed all of this with one check. I stood over my kitchen sink and burned the letter, watching the paper curl and blacken until it was nothing but ash. I washed the ash down the drain. I didn't fix it because I didn't break it. They broke it. I just refused to pay for the repairs. As for the house on Elm Street, I sold it. I couldn't keep it. The memories were too tainted, the soil too poisoned by betrayal. I sold it for a significant profit to a nice young couple who were expecting their first child. I took that money and started a scholarship fund for girls in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I wanted to help girls like me, girls who were told they were weird for liking smart things, girls who were pushed into the background while the boys were celebrated for throwing a ball. Every year, I pay for 2 girls to go to college, covering their tuition and books. That is a better legacy than enabling a brother who hates me. It has been 6 months since the barbecue, and my life has transformed into something unrecognizable. It is quiet now, but it is a peaceful quiet, not the lonely silence I used to fear. It is the silence of safety. I changed my phone number. I blocked every email address associated with my family. I even changed gyms, just in case they tried to ambush me during a workout. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain is hitting the glass of my condo, I wonder if I was too harsh. I wonder if I should have given Gage one more chance. He is my blood, after all, and we share the same history. But then I remember the feeling of that text message, "You stink up the whole party." I remember the feeling of Tegan standing in my office demanding my money as if it were her birthright. I remember my mother's laughter in the group chat, and I realised that family isn't about whose DNA you share. It's about who respects you. It's about who stands by you when you're holding the blue ribbon, not just when you're holding the checkbook. I realised that protecting yourself sometimes means cutting out the poison, even if the poison is your own flesh and blood. It hurts to cut, but it heals. I picked up the pieces of my dignity and built a fortress. And inside this fortress, the air is clean. I am still the executive vice president at Nexara. I am still single, though I've started dating a nice architect named David. He thinks my job is fascinating. He listens to me when I talk about engineering problems, his eyes lighting up with genuine interest. He doesn't ask for money. He fights me for the check at dinner. I am sitting on my balcony right now, looking at the Seattle skyline, a glass of vintage wine in my hand. My phone is on the table, and it is silent. No drama, no demands, no insults. If you are reading this and you are the weird one, or the bank for your family, or the joke they tell at parties, listen to me. Stop begging for their love. Stop explaining your worth to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Stop paying for their mistakes. Let them fall. Let them see what life looks like without you holding them up. Because one day, they will realize exactly who they underestimated, and by then, you'll be too far away to hear their apology. And trust me, the silence where their apologies should be is a beautiful sound. The weeks following the barbecue were not a fade to black, but rather a series of sharp, high-definition scenes that played out in courtrooms and lawyers' offices. While I had driven away from Elm Street with a sense of liberation, the legal machinery I had set in motion was just beginning to grind my family into dust. I had made a promise to myself that I would not intervene, that I would not pay for the repairs of the world they had broken, but that did not mean I was absent from the process. I was the primary witness, the victim, and the architect of their accountability. The first major event occurred 2 weeks after the eviction, when I was summoned to the district attorney's office. Tegan had been arrested, as expected, but her initial defense strategy was to paint this as a domestic misunderstanding, a family squabble that had gotten out of hand. She was counting on the fact that families rarely press charges against their own, relying on the shame and the blood ties to shield her from the consequences of her felony. She did not understand that for me, the blood ties had been severed the moment she mocked my existence in a group chat. I sat in the DA's office, a sterile room with grey carpet and fluorescent lighting, across from a prosecutor named Mrs. Gable. She was a sharp woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, reviewing the stack of evidence I had provided. She looked up at me and asked the question that would seal Tegan's fate. She explained that often in these cases, the victim feels pressure to recant, to drop the charges to preserve family unity. She wanted to know, for the record, if I had any intention of withdrawing my complaint regarding the identity theft and wire fraud. I looked her in the eye and told her absolutely not. I explained that this was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated, predatory act. I told her about Maverick Jones, about the pattern of behaviour, about the financial ruin she had left in her wake in Atlanta. Miss Gable nodded, closed the file, and told me that with my cooperation, they would pursue the maximum penalty. That was the moment Tegan's life truly ended. It wasn't at the barbecue. It was in that quiet office when I refused to blink. The legal proceedings that followed were brutal for Gage. Because he had signed the documents alongside Tegan, even if he claimed he was manipulated, he was entangled in the investigation. While he wasn't charged with the fraud against me, his financial life was dissected in open court. The creditors he had ignored, the loans he had defaulted on, the life insurance policies Tegan had tried to take out on him. It was all laid bare. I didn't attend every hearing, but Maverick did. He extended his stay in Seattle, treating the courthouse like a theatre. He would text me updates, describing how Tegan wept fake tears before the judge, how she tried to blame Gage for forcing her to spend money, how her stories changed every time she was pressed for details. In the end, the evidence was insurmountable. Tegan eventually took a plea deal to avoid a lengthy prison sentence, but the terms were harsh. Restitution she could never pay, a permanent criminal record, and a probation period that essentially stripped her of her freedom. She fled to the East Coast the moment she was released on bail pending sentencing, leaving Gage to deal with the wreckage alone. The collapse of my parents' life was a slower, more painful tragedy to witness from afar. I learned the details not from them, but from the network of neighbours and family members who were still trying to play both sides. The reality of Gage's debt was a black hole that swallowed everything. With Tegan gone and the creditors circling, my parents faced a choice. Let their golden child face potential legal action for bad checks and bankruptcy, or sacrifice their own security to save him. They did what they had always done. They sacrificed themselves. Putting their house on the market was the final nail in the coffin of the Anderson family legacy. That house had been the stage for all my childhood traumas, the place where I was ignored and Gage was worshipped. Hearing that it was sold to pay off the debts of a con artist felt like a grim form of poetic justice. They sold it for less than it was worth because they needed the cash quickly, desperation seeping into every financial decision they made. I drove by the old house one last time before the closing. There was a quote 8 sign on the lawn, and a moving truck was parked in the driveway. I watched from down the street as my father carried boxes out, looking 20 years older than he had just a month ago. My mother was directing the movers, her posture slumped, the frantic energy of the barbecue replaced by a heavy, defeated sluggishness. Gage was there too, carrying a box of his old trophies, plastic monuments to a high school glory that had failed to translate into a functional adulthood. It was a pathetic scene. A part of me, the part that was still a little girl wanting her daddy, felt a twinge of pity. I could have written a check. I could have stopped this. I had the power to reverse their misfortune with a single signature. But then I remembered the silence of my phone when I won the science fair, I remembered the laughter when Tegan insulted me. I remembered that they had never once tried to save me from the loneliness of my childhood. They had only contributed to it. I put the car in drive and pulled away. I didn't save them because it wasn't my job to save them from the consequences of their own favoritism. The transition to my new life was marked by the launch of the scholarship fund. I named it the quote, 9, reclaiming my last name from the mud my family had dragged it through. The first reception for the scholarship recipients was held 6 months after the barbecue, in a private room at a downtown gallery. I stood at the podium looking out at a sea of young, intelligent women, girls who loved math, girls who took radios apart, girls who had been told they were too loud or too quiet or too weird. I handed the first grant to a 19-year-old girl named Maya, who wanted to design sustainable water filtration systems. When she took the check, she hugged me, tears in her eyes, and told me that nobody else had believed in her vision. In that hug, I felt more familial connection than I had ever felt at a Thanksgiving dinner. I realized that I was building the family I should have had, a family based on mutual respect and shared passion, not just shared genetics. I was no longer the spinster with a checkbook. I was a mentor, a leader, and a change maker. And then there was David. I met him 3 months after the dust had settled, at a charity auction for the arts. He was an architect, a man who understood structure and stability, both in buildings and in people. Our first date was a revelation. We went to a small Italian restaurant, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to shrink myself. I talked about my work at Nexara, about the stress of the billion-dollar contracts, about the intricacies of prosthetic engineering. David didn't look bored. He didn't tell me I was being too technical. He didn't ask if I washed test tubes. He leaned in, his eyes lighting up, and asked intelligent questions. He was fascinated by my mind, not intimidated by it. When the check came, I reached for it out of habit, the reflex of the family bank. David gently covered my hand with his, smiled, and told me that he had it. He said he wanted to take care of me for a change. I almost cried right there over the tiramisu. It was such a small gesture, but it signaled the end of an era. I was done being the provider for people who resented me. I was allowing myself to be cared for. The final attempt at contact came just before Christmas, nearly a year after the nightmare began. It wasn't the angry letter from my mother that had come and gone, burned to ash in my sink. This was a phone call from Gage. I was sitting on my balcony with David, watching the snow fall over the city, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I usually ignored unknown numbers, but something made me answer. It was Gage. He sounded different, sober, quiet, broken. He didn't ask for money. He didn't scream. He just asked if I was happy. He said he was calling from the second bedroom of our parents' rental apartment, that he could hear them arguing in the kitchen about the heating bill. He told me that Tegan had posted a photo on Instagram with a new boyfriend in Miami, wearing a diamond bracelet. He said, "You were right, Liv. You were right about everything. I'm sorry." I held the phone to my ear, listening to the static on the line. I had waited my whole life for those words. I had fantasized about this moment, rehearsing the speeches I would give, the "I told you so" that would finally vindicate me. But now that it was here, I found that I didn't need it. His apology didn't fix the past, and it didn't change the present. He was still the man who had watched his wife try to rob me. He was still the brother who had stood by while I was mocked. An apology born from rock bottom is not the same as an apology offered from a place of strength. It is just another form of begging, I said softly. I didn't say I loved him. I didn't offer to help. I pressed the button to end the call, and then I blocked the number. I put the phone down and turned back to David, who was watching me with concern. He asked who it was. I smiled, and it was a genuine smile, one that reached my eyes and settled in my soul. I said, "And it was the truth. That version of Olivia, the one who answered to Gage, the one who desperate for crumbs of affection, no longer lived here. She had moved out, evicted along with the tenants of Elm Street. I am writing this from a place of absolute wholeness. The view from my office is no longer grey. It is bright and full of potential. The scholarship fund is growing, my team at Nexara is breaking new ground in medical technology, and my home is a sanctuary of peace. I have learned that karma isn't always a lightning bolt from the sky. Sometimes, karma is simply the natural consequence of choices compounded over time. Tegan chose greed and got a criminal record. Gage chose weakness and lost his independence. My parents chose favoritism and lost their home. And I? I chose myself. I chose to stop playing a game that was rigged against me. I chose to walk away from the barbecue and never look back. If you are standing on the edge of that decision right now, terrified of the silence that follows cutting off toxic family, let me tell you what lies on the other side. It isn't loneliness, it is freedom. It is the space to breathe, to grow, and to fill your life with people who actually see you. The silence isn't empty. It's a canvas waiting for you to paint your own future. I picked up the pen and I wrote a masterpiece. You can too. Just remember, when they tell you that you stink up the party, believe them. And then go throw your own party, where the air is clean, the champagne is yours, and the only people invited are the ones who know your worth.